Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Flagler Museum. My name is John Blades. I'm the Executive Director of the museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the trustees and the staff of the museum to the Whitehall Lecture Series. This is our 30th year of the Whitehall Lecture Series. Let me just take a couple of minutes first to thank the education staff and the curatorial staff for helping to put this lecture series together and to set it all up and make it run so smoothly. Let me take a minute to thank our sponsors as well, the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post have helped underwrite this series and make it possible. And I want to remind you to take a minute just to turn off your cell phones. Make sure they're off, please, because as luck would have it, I'm sure it'll go off in the middle of the lecture if you don't make sure it's off. And if you happen to get into the room with one of those audio tour ones, would you hold that up so we can collect that, because they have a built-in alarm that can be set off by the AV system, and it is worse than a cell phone going off, that's for sure. It wakes the dead. And by the way, every one of our lectures is webcast live, and so I want to welcome those not only who joined us here in the Grand Ballroom of Whitehall, but those who joined us online. And I want to remind those who are here that if you're not able to join us physically here at Whitehall for one of these lectures, you can join us online by going to the museum's website, clicking on a link there, and then you get to see all the slides, hear the live audio, and even submit questions at the end of the lecture. And then we archive, by the way, every lecture on something called the Gilded Age History Channel that the museum created a few years ago. If you wanted to visit that website, you'll find more than 100 videos and lectures about this particular time period in American history. You can get a nice little education just by visiting that one website. There we go. All right, so this is the second in our series of lectures, and this year's lecture series is really built around the idea that many of the great monuments that we value so much as Americans were created during this time period. And as we talked about it in developing the series, we realized that, in particular, 4 of our presidents are revered with monuments that really represent the various aspects of the American character: our physicality, our intellectuality, our conscience, and of course our soul or spirit. And joining us today is Thomas Lübke, who is the Secretary of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts in Washington, D.C., which is essentially like the Landmarks Commission for our nation's capital. He served as a secretary there since 2005, and he's responsible for the design review of all new public and private projects in the nation's capital. So he's the right guy to talk about this, for sure. He has a master's degree in architecture from Harvard, the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and he was a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome in 2010. And he's the one who edited the Centennial History of the Commission of the Fine Arts back in 2010. He served as a board member of for the Washington chapter of the American Institute of Architects. So I don't think there's anybody better qualified to talk to us today about the monuments to Washington, the Capitol Dome, and the Obelisk, as well as the Jefferson Memorial. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Thomas Lübke to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's such an exemplary building, monument in its own right to the Beaux-Arts era. I'm going to launch right into this because there's a lot of it. I've got 3 major monuments in only about 45 minutes. So I'm going to jump right in. The topic, I think it's a fascinating series. The idea of these national memorials, how they reflect the American spirit, what it was that brought them into being in the first place. And as John just said, it really comes into flower in the Beaux-Arts era. Just to set a little bit of the theme, we're talking about 3 basic forms here: obelisk, dome, temple. The real program here is about sanctifying the secular, bringing some sense of purpose, literally almost in a religious way, to the political ideals that the American closer, there we go, that the American Republic is based on. And so this actually goes, the roots are actually, it's kind of a romantic idea that really goes back to the 18th century and the whole idea of this experiment in America. I just want to say, Washington has developed this kind of image over time. This is something that everybody recognizes. It was absolutely created. You think of it as being timeless, but of course it was just designed to look timeless, and it's because it drew on such timeless ideas. How we got there is, of course, a long study. I am lucky in running this agency called the Commission of Fine Arts. It was founded in 1910. And it is, as John said, we sort of did work as a design court a little bit. We helped to guide the design of the city and have been working on it for 105 years at this point. The one idea we just want to talk to you about is the idea of this fundamental concept of freedom as an allegory, as something that drives the design, drives the philosophy, the idea of liberty, bringing nature out of its slumber. This is sort of a romantic idea, but it literally was that if you could, in the experiment of the New World, the New Republic in the New World was, if you could bring liberty to the people, you could create this new society. So the design, it was central to the iconography of the city. Liberty, this is a quote from Pamela Scott, liberty brought the federal city into being, and the city physically and symbolically embodied the country in the history of its founding. So that's the fundamental idea that we're pursuing here. So Washington, D.C. was created by an act of Congress in 1790. Jefferson and Washington themselves were very involved in this, and they brought the French engineer and Pierre L'Enfant to help create it. But this is actually Jefferson's first drawing. What you can see here, I'll just point, this is the Potomac River coming here. There's a kind of interesting spot, coincidentally not very far from Washington's own holdings down here at Mount Vernon. But there's a sort of a ridge, a bowl that we talk about here that contains this space. There's a little high point here and another big hill over there. They realized it was actually a fairly, people talk about it as being a terrible swamp, but actually it was actually a pretty nice place to put a city. You had already the navigable ports of Georgetown, Alexandria, and then up the river over here, Bladensburg. So it was actually a very clever place to locate a city. I just went back to. Jefferson's idea was to simply lay out a grid of these cities across this sort of this open area where this, the Goose Creek, we named the Tiber. Again, we're going to classical allusions here, the Tiber Creek from Rome. Across here, but they bring in L'Enfant, and L'Enfant does something amazing, which is to really start to marry topography, commerce, and symbolism all together, and that's what's such a genius about this plan, just to show you. This is called the map of dotted lines from 1791, that was the first design. Again, this is turned a little bit. The north is actually this way. I'm having trouble seeing if it's oblique, but here's that creek. Here's this high point, and here's the other high point here, which become the pieces that really anchor the whole composition, one for the Capitol, one for the executive branch. So it's the marriage of these symbolic pieces that represent the government, that again, that experiment of this republic government on the commercial grid. The commercial grid is what allows society to happen, and then in between it gets connected with these radial pieces. These are literally designed to be commemorative pieces, and that idea gets developed. In the middle of the city, I'm just going to go quickly, this is sort of a little bit later, called the tin case map by Dermot, which is where they literally were trying to sell the plots off. But it starts to really, you can really see now, this is the grid, this is the White House complex, the Capitol's actually just off the map here. This little space emerging along that creek bed is what it really becomes the mall. You can see this sort of L-shaped space that is the beginning of that public space. This is the plan of the city based on L'Enfant's work, where you really get the whole sense of the city, the Capitol, the White House, and this wonderful combination of pieces. Moving in, the capital letter A right there. So this is the north axis, the east-west axis, Capitol here. At that crossing was an idea that there was going to be a monumental statue of George Washington. It's funny now, we were just talking about this, Washington, well, I'll get to that in a sec. It took the city of Washington, these were huge dreams. And they took, like great dreams, they took decades and generations to actually carry out. And the actually amazing thing is that it was carried out. This is a view from the heights of Georgetown looking down and into the city. This is in 1801. Not much to report yet, folks. This now, another generation later, this is from the Anacostia River. And in the early 19th century, you can start to see the city just beginning to take shape. It's a little bit exaggerated in terms of the heights, but this is the Capitol sitting on Capitol Hill. This is the Navy Yard. And over there on that little rise above is the White House, and all this land in here is what this would become the National Mall. Big ideas. Dickens called it a city of magnificent distances because there really wasn't a whole lot there. This is a view of the Capitol in, I think it's about 1830 from what is now, if anybody knows this, this is basically looking to the southwest. This is bucolic landscape. This is actually where Union Station is today. It's hard to imagine. So, back to our story of Washington. Washington and the man. So, the interesting thing about these memorials, we are talking about memorials dedicated to these figures, these physical beings who were politicians. They were just regular people, and there's a certain migration through the symbolism that makes them associate them with ideas and acts, and then they actually becomes very abstract. And there is no one who becomes more abstract than George Washington. If you go back 100 years, people really thought about George Washington, but I would tell you that people today don't think so much about him. If you think of like we hear tourists going, well, where's the Washington Monument? And who's that dedicated to? And why? They think it might be for the city of Washington. So the point is that it has become, it's a symbol of Washington, the man, and then it becomes a symbol of Washington, the general, and the country, and then by extension, the republic for which it stands. There's a certain kind of abstraction that goes on. But there was, in the 19th century still, there was a lot of interest in Washington the man, and this is one of our favorite pieces of commemoration, is Washington as God. This was a sculpture which was commissioned actually by Congress in the 1830s by a sculptor named Horatio Greenough. It was, you can already see this kind of turning a human into something a little bit more divine here. It's literally based on classical precedents. It was considered, it ran into a lot of controversy up front because it was so strange, because people actually still thought of Washington as a guy, and here he is, and he's half clothed, and is he a god, is he a man, is he, someone joked, he's calling for his clothes, So they didn't really know what to do with it. It was actually on display in the Capitol Rotunda for many years, but eventually it found its place out in the yard of the grounds of the Capitol. Here are these little school children in 1905 checking it out. And eventually you can still see this sculpture. It's at the National Museum of American History. The other statue, the Equestrian Statue that we never got, in the middle of the mall. This is in Washington Circle in Washington. This is on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's a big statue, but it's not that colossal kind of thing. So all this was scaled down. But then this is his tomb, actually called the New Tomb at Mount Vernon. This was actually built in the 1830s. That idea, though, of commemorating him did continue, and so this program of commemorating Washington stayed alive. I just want to I'm introducing here the idea of the immortality of Washington and his contribution to the very creation of this country. Already we're seeing, this is in the mid-19th century now, a tomb. We've got the obelisks, which are actually for other family members, but linking the idea of immortality. This was not the first obelisk in America. This is actually the Bunker Hill Memorial, which was designed in the 1820s. in Boston. Some of you may have seen it. There was a big interest in a lot of this archaeology coming out of the French campaigns in Egypt and other cultural influences from the late 18th century and then reaching this country. This is the first monumental use of the obelisk in the United States, coming again from Egypt. Now, ancient Egypt, the interesting thing, this is a lot of these symbols now get associated with gods of the sky, the heavens, okay? The obelisk in Egypt is associated with Amun-Ra, or the cult of Akhenaten, which is the Middle Kingdom monotheism for the sun god. It literally is understood to be the petrified ray of the sun. In other words, that it's kind of a ray coming down from God, maybe perhaps the eye of God coming down to earth. So what it comes to symbolize is, of course, the divine on earth, the authority of heaven, and if you take that a little bit further, it easily becomes political authority and empire as it comes through the ages. Now, the Egyptians got it, the Romans found it in a few centuries BC, and there are probably, I think, more obelisks in Rome from Egypt than there are still in Egypt, because they liked it so much, and of course every square in Rome's got one, but probably the most famous here is at the Vatican in Rome. This, of course, I just suddenly leapt forward 1,500 years. But this was, again, a question, this is a question of this idea of cultural appropriation, taking a form and bringing it forward. It went from Egypt, it went to classical Rome. It is then sort of reintroduced in the Baroque era, really with the idea of re-sanctifying these symbols of authority for religious purposes. Now, so we're taking something that is highly religious and purposing it to a new religion, which in turn has its own political program. It happens everywhere. The French do it. This is the Place de la Concorde in Paris. It's a very important site in the French Revolution. Again, that idea of bringing a sacred form and using it to give a sanctity to the secular undertaking. Now, the obelisk is not the only thing. In London, for example, probably the most famous is a similar thing is the Nelson column from the 1840s. It's vertical. And of course, everybody has to understand how height in these days would have been so much more impressive than we see it today with all the skyscrapers. But before the age of elevators, a 170-foot high column with a colossal statue on top was mighty impressive. Nelson himself, was the admiral that helped, that brought the British century of domination over the Navy and the world's oceans, and so he was aptly commemorated. This idea is also brought to the United States in Baltimore. This is for, guess who? George Washington, designed 1815, executed then. I think it's completed in 1829. The designer here is a guy named Robert Mills, who is from South Carolina, actually. I should note that the second place winner in this competition was actually an obelisk. But Mills' design won first place. Mills himself is thought of as, some call him the very first American trained architect. There's some debate over that. It might be Charles Bulfinch of Boston. He was a Freemason. He worked with Latrobe in Philadelphia. He did major public buildings on the East Coast. In Washington, he's famous for, in the 1830s and 40s, after the Capitol and the White House complexes, there were just a few smaller public buildings, and he was the designer who brought us 3 major public buildings there: the Treasury Department, the Patent Office building in the Doric order, the Treasury Department in the Ionic order, and the General Post Office in the Corinthian order. So he was very much a dedicated classicist and knew his stuff. he entered a competition then in 1836 for the Washington Monument. And guess what? There's our obelisk. Now this is what won, and this is what they started to build. You can see it's a very different scheme, particularly with all that stuff at the base. You got a sort of the top is different. It's a little bit more slender. At the bottom is this Doric Temple was supposed to honor 30 Revolutionary War heroes. And so optimistically, this is a lithograph from the 1840s. Where's my? I want to just point out, so this is by the 1840s. This is conjectural. This has not been built at this point, but you can see this whole sweep of the city. Capitol at one end, White House, there's that L. This is the mall in between, in the Tiber Creek Canal. And you can see these big buildings that Mills also did. There's the Treasury, the Patent Office, and the Post Office. So it's kind of an interesting point in time. They start to build it, and they get about a third of the way up. They start building it in 1846, and after 5 years they stopped. The oncoming issues with the Civil War, etc., interrupt construction. There's a huge story here which I can't get into, but it is literally stopped for 25 years through the Civil War. Eventually in the 1870s they're trying to figure out what to do with it. This is my favorite proposal by a sculptor named Vinnie Toxie. She suggested that we put a colossal statue use this just as a base. But they didn't do, they actually got their act together, and by the 1879 start to build it, and eventually it gets completed here in 1885. A couple of different things. The base is never really dealt with. They never really figure out what to do with it. They do a bit much steeper top. What's called the pyramidon is a much steeper idea. It's immense. It's 555 feet tall. There's nothing like it. And it's in the middle of a kind of a funny, discontinuous landscape, which I'm going to show you. But I want to point out, here's this Tiber Creek Canal coming out here. That's a dredging boat. This is an important thing because in the 1880s they begin to do a lot of landfill and creating acres and acres and acres of new land on what had been the tidal mud flats. They would never let you do it today. But that was what created the West Potomac Park, which becomes a big part of the story as the mall expands. This is just a little glimpse of the Washington Monument in what is the mall, and it's sort of hard to imagine what a disjointed space it was in the 19th century. But let's talk about our domes for a minute. Again, appealing back to our start, the idea of bringing this sacred and emblazoning it on this secular undertaking. It really, you get the dome is this sort of symbolic of the sky and the sky god, and it creates this sense of authority and cosmos right here on Earth. It's no accident. This is the first design that is known for the U.S. Capitol, 1791. This is not what was built, but it was proposed by a French architect, Etienne Allais, known as Stephen Hallett. He comes here. This drawing is called the Fancy Piece. And what it does is it presents this idea. It's very clear. It presents the constitutionally ordered government by the few, the Senate, government by the many, the House of Representatives, so bicameral with this central piece with that dome of authority in the middle. It's a very clear, simple idea. And what's interesting is that idea stays. We don't see this as new or unusual, but in its own way, it's extremely, it's simple pieces put together in a unique way that hadn't been done quite like this. So it has an incredible staying power. The actual design of one was by Dr. William Thornton, 1793. You can see this is a little sort of flatter, sort of chunkier version of it, but it's the same composition. And trying to bring in these ideas of civic virtue and self-government. And it stays with it. Eventually it gets burned with the British and rebuilt. In the 1820s, we have this new version of it, built by the Bullfinch, who I just mentioned a minute ago. It's a little bit higher. It's still the same idea, and what you get inside there's a sort of a sense that you're reprising the Pantheon in Rome on the inside of the surface. The Pantheon is sort of the mother of all these forms. The temple front with the dome. It's very interesting because it's exactly as wide as it is tall. There's a certain purity of the idea of a circle inside. That's Pennsylvania Avenue, paved with wood at the time, lined with poplar trees. But the Pantheon, as I said, is really it was the largest spanning structure of antiquity. It's 142 feet across. No one ever before had done that. This is an immense space for the time, all made out of unreinforced concrete. It was an engineering marvel that was not surpassed until way into the Renaissance period. So it's fantastically important in this history. Jefferson had big influence on all of the undertakings, architectural. Both liturgically and as we're talking about the secular story here. The only contender in scale this is Hagia Sophia, or St. Sophia in Istanbul, or Constantinople. This is the seat of the Eastern Church, and it is the only one that came close. It's a lower dome. If they built it once, it collapsed. They rebuilt it. This is in the 6th century. Very impressive thing. Not nearly as wide as it's only 100 feet across. The one thing that's really amazing about it is this ring of windows here in the ribbed vault. It actually, from underneath, it sort of makes the dome appear to float. Okay, and relates again that idea of this sky, the connection to the divine above. So we're trying to link sacred forms now, and it's going to go through the high Renaissance and then be taken up by this in a secular way. This is St. Peter's again in Rome, based on the engineering of Brunelleschi in Florence, which you may know is a very steep dome. Steeper domes being much more structurally viable than the flat ones. The flat ones tend to want to collapse. The steeper ones are more stable. So this is a design that was started by Michelangelo, carried out by Della Porta and Fontana, built in the late 16th century. And what you can see now, instead of just the dome itself, you've got this big drum of columns. This is helping to carry the force, outward force, plus this thing called the tholos on top, which helps to anchor it. So this becomes the formula for these great monumental domes. Again, thinking back before elevators and tall buildings, how magnificent these things would be. You could see them for miles. In London, St. Paul's Dome. This is in the end of the 17th century. So Christopher Wren, this is a little bit smaller, 110, but it creates a monumental identity for the city of London. Paris, the Invalides is also about the same time, and also St. Genevieve's in Paris. They keep going with these ever higher layers, 1, 2, 3, 4, getting much more vertical. By the time we get to the 19th century, this dome technology is starting to get some modern construction methods. This is an example of another major church. This is actually in St. Petersburg. This is the Cathedral of St. Isaac's. It's the largest Orthodox church, and the fourth largest church, or at least fourth largest church, I think, that exists. Designed by a French architect, Montferrand. The reason I'm showing you these is that these were all precedents that were looked at by Thomas Walter, the architect of the dome in the Capitol. This one was particularly interesting to him because it used the novel technology of cast iron in building it. So you're sort of moving away from the Romans used unreinforced concrete, Brunelleschi used brick. You're seeing it in Soufflot's dome in Paris starts to use a lot of connections made of iron. This is the one that really starts to be more structurally iron, and Walter really takes that the next step. So he's born in 1804. He's Philadelphia and worked under the office of William Strickland. In 1851, he's appointed the architect of a massive expansion project for the Capitol by President Fillmore. And this is a question of taking that original building and just moving it out in all directions. Instead of having the dome with the two wings, he actually puts two bigger wings on either side and a bigger dome on top. So it's sort of like going off in all directions. The dome, now this is in a period when the Union is starting to erode, but there's a sense that this has to be continued. This is Walter's design, and it's interesting on the inside and out. Look at this now. So now we've got 1, 2, so 3. We keep going with these little layers. It's extremely vertical. It's 254 feet tall. What's also interesting, so we got the drum, the second layer, the dome itself, the tholos, we've got the statue at the top. What's interesting, as part of the composition, to make it seem bigger, so it's all connected, you can see it's all made out of cast iron, and it's resting on the original walls, but to make it seem bigger and more grand, they actually added this drum, but it's not doing that structural load that it was in those older domes, which is holding the forces. This is actually, you can see it's just cantilevered, like a skirt out. It's actually for the visual effect of saying the Union is here and it's going to stay. So they actually start building it in 1856, 1859. This again, look at the mall in front of the Capitol. It's a canal. It starts to come up in the 1860s. Now, this is a picture I actually remember from a high school textbook. This is in the corridors of the Capitol. It shows, this is an apocryphal story of Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln saying we must continue up, gotta keep this dome going during the Civil War. The truth is that they had already bought all the steel, or the cast iron that was lying about it. They didn't actually keep going with the construction. They probably have to use it for cannon balls or something. So they actually did just keep it going on a slow level, and they finished it. Brumidi was he was a sort of Greek Italian American painter who worked in Rome and then came here and did up a lot of corridors and did a lot of these ceiling paintings and frescoes. But of course, the crowning glory, just to touch on our Washington story, is this thing that you saw earlier in the program. This is the Apotheosis of George Washington, speaking of marrying the secular with the sacred. This is right out of Baroque painting, religious painting. We have Washington here flanked by victory and liberty, and 13 allegorical figures of the colonies and various scenes in which he's doing everything. But literally, apotheosis means becoming a god. So this is that story of abstraction, taking a human, turning him into an idea, turning him in, and representing him in a physical way. At the top, the freedom figure. This is a 20-foot tall, 7.5-ton bronze by Freedom, called Freedom, Statue of Freedom. It was controversial in its own way because this was. If you go back to the picture there, we've got the freedom cap of liberty here, victory and liberty wearing a freedom cap. It was the emancipated slaves cap from ancient Rome. So that was the original design for liberty here. That was not going to be possible when this was being built when it was being designed and executed in the 1850s. But the dome was completed. This is an image from 1865 from Lincoln's second inaugural, just 6 weeks before he was assassinated. And what's interesting here is how this dome, and I'm quoting a historian, Kendall Wallace, it takes a form laden with symbolic and sacred meaning and ascribes a radically secular meaning to it. It's meant to evoke a connection of classical origins of democracy and republicanism and the legislative power of the republic, which has been sanctified. The idea of religious association and sky symbolism persists in the resonance of the providential overtones of America's sense of its vocation in the world. So there's a connection with the form, the religious sanctification, and this idea of destiny. Manifest destiny, a huge concept in America in the 19th century, and to some extent I think that that spirit carries forward through into our own era. The form of the Capitol, again, you think of it, it's so reflexive, it's the Capitol. But at the time it was something new, and it was extended then in the late 19th century to dozens of capitals in states across the country, and then even in the county courthouses all across in the Midwest and Texas, and sort of it becomes an incredibly powerful form. And this is a little, again, I'll take a little pause. This is where we are now in 1870. The dome is completed. We're seeing the city develop a whole lot more. White House, unfinished Washington Monument, which does get finished, and we're starting to fill in some of that monumental thing. But what you can understand here is that the city is a bit of a hodgepodge. Here's the mall. Smithsonian is there. You just don't understand it the way we have the city, the way you understand the city today. The temple. The temple, then, is really our last typology, which focuses on how bringing that individual leader, the philosophy that he represents, and then bringing it in, sanctifying it with this ancient form. A little bit of background here. This is a view. This is a view west from the Lincoln Washington Monument to those grounds that I was saying were being remade out of the mud flats, and what to do with that land. I know you talked about this last week, but the importance of the Chicago Fair cannot be underestimated. This was designed principally by Daniel Burnham, the Chicago architect and planner, and put forward this kind of monumental classical idea in people's mind in a very grand, integrated way. Apparently quite mind-blowing at the time. Literally a third of the country saw it. Literally 1/3 of the population of the United States actually went to Chicago and saw this thing. For most people, it was the first time they'd ever seen electric lights. It was overwhelming. People would fall down in tears when they saw it. But what it did is it cemented in people's minds that there was an appropriate aspirational style for the United States. The United States at this point is actually a burgeoning economic, cultural, diplomatic, you name it, power, coming from kind of a backwater in the mid-19th century to really emerging at the end of the 19th century as a world power, taking on the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And the sense was that suddenly this idea of America's destiny has to be revealed, and it should be revealed in Washington, its capital, which right now looks like this. You've got the Capitol here. This is the mall. You've got the agricultural department, and you've got orchards and fisheries and planting beds. You've got sort of the pretty gardens of the Smithsonian. You've got 2 train stations, a canal, apartment buildings. It's kind of a big mess, and the sense was we need to bring Burnham, and we need to the architect of the fair, and bring this idea of this monumental classicism to Washington. And so they do in 1901. The Senate commissions a plan called the Senate, the Macmillan Plan, and the idea is actually to bring that idea to Washington. The reason why this is important to our story is because we're starting to now lay out the real composition that you understand today. This is a new imposition. See, everything is all sort of bright and white and legible against this kind of, bricky brown mess that is the city. But you get the Capitol now ringed by these buildings, this mall coming down, the White House complex, and these new temple areas. In all of this land which has been reclaimed, all of this stuff is new. We call this the Kite Plan. This is from the Macmillan Capitol, the White House. Originally, that was our little L with our little statue of Washington was going to go there. Now we've got this thing which we call the Kite Plan. It's been extended both axes to the west and to the south, creating this huge space. The Washington Monument itself was erected slightly off-center because of structural reasons of the foundations, and this plan actually sort of works it in. They tilt you can see this is a little bit slanted. They tilt the whole thing a degree just to make it on center, and they kind of try to work it so that it takes in this whole new composition. And the star of the show is, of course, the Washington Monument, which now is sort of this, it's this huge, it's like a teenager who's just suddenly grown, 6 inches in a year, and like, what do you do with it? This doesn't exist like this. You saw the last picture. This is what it looked like. Oops, wrong direction. This is what it looked like. And this is what they were trying to get. And the amazing thing is they actually kind of got there. That Macmillan plan proposed a temple kind of idea to President Lincoln at the west end of this extended landscape. Very controversial in its own way. Number one, that the Speaker of the House, it's Joe Cannon from Illinois, he didn't want a monument to President Lincoln at the end of what he called a goddamn swamp. So that was hugely problematic, but they actually got there. This was at the south side. This is the White House, Washington Monument. This is the south side. This was a precinct of temples honoring a national hero or a great individual called the Washington Commons. That was what it was called, but they had some idea that it would probably be an important figure. This becomes the site of the Jefferson Memorial, and guess what? It even kind of looks like it. This is done in 1902, these images. I'm going to introduce our third and last designer here, John Russell Pope, who is really the last of the great American classicists. He sort of closes the chapter on Beaux-Arts classicism in America, actually maybe anywhere. He's so good, he's actually, he gets called to actually do additions to the National Gallery in London. 1874 to 1937, he was astoundingly good at what he did. He had a terrific sense of how to take the classical details and put them in an original way. You have, what's happening now in the 20th century is that things are getting bigger. Industrialization, things are just, there's just bigger, more complicated stuff. And Pope had this incredible way of handling it so that it looked just absolutely beautiful. Not everybody could do that. So he gets involved in actually the design of the Lincoln Memorial back in the teens. Now, these are two ideas that he had for them. This is different sites, but you can see a very severe Doric Temple, even a pyramid. There's crazy stuff. There's stepped Mayan pyramids. He's got crazy. But look at the absolutely delicious qualities of these designs that he has. This is what was actually in the Macmillan plan by the New York architect Charles McKim and White, one of the most preeminent Beaux-Arts design firms. This is based on a kind of a gate, really a propylaeon here. Virginia is just on the other side. The symbolism here, I'm not going to get into the whole idea of Lincoln, this project particularly, but Lincoln, who brought the Union through the Civil War. This is at the western end of the mall, right across from Virginia. There's this whole sense of Lincoln and rapprochement to the south, to the American South. The Memorial Bridge becomes a link. It's actually a whole program. I think very strongly that the Lincoln Memorial is not only Lincoln, but it's actually, in its own way, it's a national Civil War memorial. And of course, in the 20th century, it becomes, later, it becomes even more than that. This was actually the prize, the design that was won for the Lincoln Memorial by Henry Bacon. Again, a temple. This is a fascinating topic, and it is the perfect example to talk about in depth, and it's what you'll get that next week. So I'm going to move on. The point is, this is a president who is then venerated for his ideas, his leadership, and put in a temple. It's an unusual thing, and then it's a temple turned sideways. Extremely inventive. There it is, completed in this is actually completed in 1922, anchoring that great mall axis here. You can see this is still sort of, they haven't really figured out what to do, and in the meantime, they put some World War I buildings there. It was put up, and they didn't come down until 1971. The guy who approved that was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy named Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he thought it was the worst thing he'd ever done in his entire career. It's truly true. So above, this is the tidal basin, which is sort of what's left of that dredging area. And this is where they talked about having that other temple. And this is selected, thought of as probably a good place for Jefferson. But by the 20s, a number of things are happening, particularly transportation, access of images, media. The image of Washington is actually starting to come forward in a way that we would all understand it to be. These beautiful banks of curving cherry trees, the soaring monument in the background, a frame of classical building. These are all the elements that start to read as Washington literally swimming. The Potomac Park area was designated to be recreational. They actually had beaches on the tidal basin here, and they sort of converted old fisheries, into this kind of recreational area. This is a pretty interesting thing. Just a little side note. This is from 1925. This was an independent proposal by a presidential commission to commemorate Theodore Roosevelt in this same area, and this is by Pope. So Pope keeps coming back with this idea after idea for these commemorations. This is a gigantic 200-foot fountain flanked by these pavilions. The axis of the 16th Street, the White House, down. It does not get built. It never gets, really never gets anywhere. But it's the idea, this sort of open landscape, is sort of the wave of the future. So keep that in your heads. I just want to go back. Oops, I'm rushing ahead here. I keep pressing the wrong button. The idea of commemorating the great man really comes out of it's a romantic idea from the late 18th century, this idea of the genius emerging, and he must be commemorated and shown to everyone it's a different idea than what they had before, and different from the way we think of it today is that often we think of people as being the products of their education, their social context, etc. There was a real sense of the cult of the genius, and what I was going to get to is this is the 1790s, very influential design for a temple to Friedrich the Great of Prussia. Now, it seems kind of like an odd thing I brought up, but it had a tremendous influence in architectural thinking at the time. First of all, after the period of the Rococo, this is extremely abstract and forceful architecture. Very severe Doric Temple on a very blocky base. You get a triumphal arch, and there's the obelisks. It's all saying this was an amazing individual, great thinker who actually recreated a new European state. So this becomes extremely important. And we associate this now with the term called revolutionary classicism. And the spoiler here was Etienne Boulet's idea. This was a cenotaph to Newton, a cenotaph being a tomb without the body. Basically, it is a temple in the most severe, abstract, and grandiose terms to the man who understood gravity. This is it's so simple, unbuildable, of course, but it's so simple in the way it presents this idea of sheer genius, in this huge sphere surrounded by these rings. This is sort of the spirit that comes out of the Romantic era, and I think infuses the idea of temples to the secular that we're seeing in the 20th century. Again, we cannot get away from the Pantheon as sort of the most important precedent. It informs much of Renaissance Palladian architecture. Lord Burlington in the 18th century in Britain, and of course the guy who really likes it a lot and brings it to America is Thomas Jefferson, who's so involved in the architecture and the state making in the United States. he used the Pantheon as the model for the University of Virginia. This is in the 1820s. It's a sort of a half-scale idea of a replica of the Pantheon. The idea of the Pantheon, maybe it's a place, it's cosmological. It's a circle inside. It contains this sense of the universe. That's where he puts the library, all the knowledge contained within this sphere. He used that form similarly for his own fourth renovation, or third or fourth renovation of Monticello. But several decades later, well, 6 or 7 decades later, 1890s, again, McKinley and White, the Beaux-Arts firm in New York, uses this very similar idea for Low Library at Columbia University in New York. This is now the 1890s. In Washington, the National Museum, they've outgrown the castle, they've outgrown their exhibition hall. This is a permanent place to display all the scientific knowledge of America in one building. This is what they come up with again. It's really based on that idea of this domical shape. And so that brings us forward back once again to John Russell Pope. This is the National Gallery of Art, right very close to the last building. This is, once again, it's Pope's genius of taking a huge building. This is basically a giant treasure chest, solid walls that you cannot get into, gigantic bronze doors. It's got no windows. Somehow it doesn't look anything like that. It doesn't look like a fortress in any way. It looks like a temple. He's got this beautiful colonnade, and the dome. There's a lot of controversy. Do we need yet another dome on the mall? But in the end, it was a brilliant move on Pope's part to use that piece to orient the visitor inside the space. So Pope is actually hired. He was twice that gets passed over, well, for the Lincoln Memorial and then that Roosevelt Memorial that didn't get built. So he's actually asked by the Jefferson Commission to design the Jefferson Memorial. Now, by this time, he's in his 70s, or late 60s. He comes up with a number of schemes, again, these beautiful, beautiful things. This is a Jefferson Memorial for Lincoln Park, which is east of the Capitol, and again, based on the Maison Carrée and Nîmes, which was admired by Jefferson, and another sort of gateway idea. This is where the Hirshhorn galleries would fit just right inside there. But there's an interesting idea. This is this colonnade, and there's this statue. So this idea keeps coming back. You saw it in that Roosevelt Memorial. But the first scheme that he pursues, this is called Scheme A for the Jefferson Memorial, takes that Macmillan plan idea of the platform floating in water, holding the axis, and a pantheon right there, representing Jefferson as the ideals of the country. Jefferson, the man, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the ideals of the nation sanctified in a temple. They go through a number of iterations. This is Scheme B, which is very similar, except it's got four pediments on either side. They come through the Commission of Fine Arts, which is the agency I work for. By this time, this is the 30s, and the sense that classicism in the Beaux-Arts era and academic training is over. And they really want to start to see, frankly, a more modern treatment. Now, this is where that idea of the pavilions, the temple goes away, and they want to start to see colonnades and look at the landscape as the figure. So it's a little hard to understand this in plan, but what we have here is that was that last scheme, a temple. This is a sort of an open kind of a little pavilion, and this is the scheme of the two colonnades with the landscape in the middle. And that's what the Commission of Fine Arts eventually favors. What happens is that actually Pope died in the middle of this story in 1937. There was this huge controversy in the review process. The Commission of Fine Arts is shifting towards modernism. There's an uproar in the press. Everybody says, why are we building these old temples, and etc. In the end, the Commission of Fine Arts approves this, but his widow, who is Sadie or Sarah, Pope, she's actually, it turns out that she's conveniently President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's cousin, and she insists that they go back to the Temple scheme, and they do. So the president rolls my commission, much to their great concern, and the chairman resigns. That's what happens, it's Washington. So this is the final scheme, which is basically a variant of Scheme E. It's carried out by his associates, Eggers and Higgins. Here it is under construction in the very early 40s on that site. The sanctification idea. Here's the statue. And what we've got are these, it's a statue of him. It's strange because it's not lit from the sky. It's actually only side lit. And then you've got these texts. Like in the Lincoln Memorial, you've got these essential texts which really illustrate that individual's contribution. Here we have the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Bill of Rights and others. They're somewhat truncated. But that becomes really part of the formula. And there it is in its completion. Fisk Kimball was the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art and an architect, and he worked at Monticello. He was on that Jefferson Memorial Commission, and he was the one who had to face this controversy of the Beaux-Arts versus the modern. His thoughts about this at the end were, I am very sympathetic with the effort to end the petrified forest in Washington, which is what he meant by the classical poems. But I feel, in view of Jefferson's own strong feelings about the classic, that the Jefferson Memorial is not the place to begin. Let us carry out the proposal for the memorial, which has the full approval of the president, and in the spirit of pious respect for Jefferson's traditions, let us then turn to the task of infusing the architecture of Washington henceforth with a modern character. So he understands, and it is in fact the case, and this was the last of these big federal projects that was done very much in a Beaux-Arts manner. So that ends that chapter. This is dedicated, I believe, in 1942. I have a coda to talk about, but I don't know if we have time. Where are we with that? Should we open it up for a few questions at this point? Okay. So, a lot of material there. I'm losing my voice. Can I answer any questions about it in the meantime? Yes, ma'am.
When we look at the Lincoln Memorial, where Lincoln faces the Capitol building and the Washington Monument, was there ever any discussion to open the back of that monument, similarly like Jefferson did, so that you could see Lincoln on both sides?
I think,
Repeat the question.
Oh, thank you. The question was, in the design of the Lincoln Memorial, which is holding the western end of the mall, you look out and you see to the east towards the Capitol, but there's a blank wall at the rear, and was there a question about having it go both ways? And I think the original designs I showed was that more gateway thing, which was open. I think you have to go back to Bacon's sense of what the Lincoln Memorial was about, which is really really about a temple. It's very much about a processional of going up more steep. It actually gets more and more difficult as you go up, and when you finally get to the top, first you're winded because it's high. The second is then you see this incredibly imposing, deep pathos in the sculpture, and it has a backdrop. And I think it was intended to not have the distraction of the background. And then the amazing thing is you can turn around and you can see the entire composition of the city before you with the Capitol in the distance and the Washington Monument. It's very powerful, and I think that probably, I'm just surmising as a designer, he probably felt it would have been distracting to see through. It's an interesting question. Maybe you'll hear about it from James Perocco next.
That wasn't an option for the Jefferson Memorial, for example.
Well,
there was no view back the other way.
There isn't. You get a view of the White House. It's not as spectacular. It's just shorter. It doesn't have quite the same oomph. The question was, did it have the same, did they look at that for the Jefferson Memorial? But in fact, there was this big concern to keep it open and keep it an open landscape idea, which in the end was not followed, but they went back to the temple form. Yes, sir.
It's obvious that the concept of axes is very important in this whole scheme. Is there any connection right back of the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, is the Memorial Bridge. And it's on an axis with the Lee Custis Mansion in Arlington. And then, if I'm not mistaken, that's on some sort of axis with one of the mansions in the city itself. I'm not sure what it was.
So the question was, and it's a very, it's quite correct, that there's a big concern with axes and these sort of reciprocal views from one monument to the other in the city. Is this fundamental to the design of Washington? The question was how, when you go out to the Lincoln Memorial and then you get to Arlington, the question is how does axes connect, and is there some other connection? And the first thing I would say is remember that they twisted the axis just a degree or so to get it to line up from with the line from the Capitol. Then they get to the Lincoln, and the idea of the Lincoln was that it was the end of this composition. It's the sort of the border. Like at Versailles, it's literally a device called the rond point, which is the round point in which you hit the end and you go boink, you spray into the landscape in all directions. The Memorial Bridge actually follows that one of those radial lines. Now it's not axial but radial, and it does connect to Arlington House. What you might have heard is that the Lee family, Custis Lee Mansion in Arlington, was one family, and they had cousins who lived in Georgetown and Tudor Place. And they were so high that you could see across, and actually the apocryphal stories that, the children, as kids growing up there, they would send their cousins messages by lantern light. Of course, by the time of the Civil War, the Lee Mansion was inappropriated, and then they used it to bury the Union dead on the Confederate general's yard. It's actually kind of an interesting twist. Yes, back there.
It seems like a lot of the construction was going on during periods of controversy. For example, you mentioned earlier the trouble with Washington Monument, and then during the Civil War, the Capitol. What about the Jefferson Memorial during the Depression? How did people feel about the amount of money and opulence associated with all these stuff?
It's an interesting question. Is that a lot of these monuments seem to coincide with a certain time of turbulence or controversy. Some of these examples from the mid-19th century, certainly the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument, sort of coinciding, by decades with the Civil War. The specific question, what was the sense about the Jefferson Memorial being erected at the end of the Depression into the Second World War? So there's probably two answers, and I have a whole lecture about this. These national memorials are always controversial. If they're actually national, like right now we're sort of battling out this Eisenhower Memorial. Certainly the Martin Luther King Memorial had its problems. The World War II Memorial. I'm just going back. Everybody here probably remembers the controversies of the Vietnam Memorial. It's just if they're important enough, then people really care, and there's always controversy. To put it in context, I think in the mid-19th century, the Civil War was a sort of all-encompassing thing. It literally stopped the Washington Monument from ever being built for 30 years. The Capitol was another story where they had a little bit more direct control, and they'd already bought the material. So they were just going to keep going. The 30s, it's a different kind of story. The 30s was a time of tremendous government call what you want, spending, investment, construction. There's just constant, decades worth of building and building and building and building schools, hospitals, bridges, libraries. It was a huge government policy to build. So I don't think that generally people had the sense that it was a problem. I think that they felt that it was the appropriate thing to do at the time.
Question over here.
Thank you. Excellent lecture.
Thank you.
And can you explain how it was decided, what was going to be the statues on top of the Capitol Dome? And I know you touched a little bit on what it stands for.
I don't have the detail on that. I know that the sense was that it was going to be an allegorical figure of freedom. It was commissioned as part of the process. The sculptor's name, someone here probably knows. Anybody? I've got it written down, it's just a question of finding it. Here it is, Thomas Crawford. So I can't tell, there's obviously lots of information about how that happened. The question is, how did it get selected? If we go back to that first quote that I mentioned, there's always been this sense that freedom or liberty is driving the whole program. So it's literally driving the idea of bringing the right political philosophy to bring the right government institutions to create the better society so that men can be free, men and women can be free in modern terms. So I think that that essential question of the allegorical representation of freedom on the top was always at the very, very heart of what was driving this. I don't know, in terms of coming up with that, I can't tell you that's a precise story, but I know that it was always underneath it.
I think that's it.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Terrific. That was terrific. That's exactly what we were hoping for. I wanted to make a couple of quick connections for you, though, about things that you might find more meaningful in Whitehall as a consequence. For example, when they finished the Obelisk to Washington, they capped it with 1 pound of pure aluminum, which for them was a magic metal, which is why, for example, Flagler would choose to use pure aluminum leaf in the drawing room here at Whitehall, which is an homage to Marie Antoinette. And those torchères in the drawing room, by the way, are coated, they're bronze, they're coated with an amalgam of silver and aluminum. The idea was to make it look like silver but not have to polish it. They're the only light fixtures like that in the world that we've been able to find so far that were treated that way. They're made by Caldwell and the company. It's impossible to overstate the fascination with aluminum. In fact, during most of Flagler's lifetime, aluminum was more expensive than platinum or gold because there was no easy way to extract it, though it's one of the most common minerals on Earth. The other connection I wanted to make for you is John Russell Pope. Mary Lily Flagler's Mary Lily Keenan's best friend growing up was Sadie Pembroke Jones, and she ended up marrying John Russell Pope. In fact, they named their daughter Mary after Mary Lily Keenan. So there's a nice connection there. John Russell Pope certainly did a sympathetic addition to another Carrere and Hastings building. Of course, this being a Carrere and Hastings building. The other one that he modified was the Frick collection in New York. So a really accomplished architect and someone who had a great Flagler connection as well. Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thank you to those who joined us online. Thank you to our sponsors, Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post. You found a magazine in your seats, many of you did. It's the Art and Culture magazine for Palm Beach County. That's published by our Cultural Council of Palm Beach County. It's a great guide to the art and culture here in the county. And of course, one of our primary grantors here at the Flagler Museum is the Cultural Council of Palm Beach County. Next week, we're going to be back here at the same time and same channel for a lecture on the Lincoln Memorial by James Percoco. I hope you'll all join us here then, either here in the Grand Ballroom or online through the museum's website. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks again, Tom. That was terrific.